In today's episode of Today in World War II, we're going to talk about some sheer lunacy on the part of the Belgians. We'll talk about a Luftwaffe ace notching 3 wins. We'll talk about a huge solid that the United States Congress and Franklin Roosevelt did for the Brits. We'll go over an incredibly brave commando raid that unfortunately went for naught in the North Africa campaign. We'll talk about the commissioning of a new aircraft carrier in the South Pacific, and we'll finally wrap it up with a great victory of a U.S. submarine in the Yellow Sea against the Japanese. Let's get started. So, speaking of lunacy, let's go in and talk about the Belgians. All right, this is on November 17, 1939. The war plan for the Allies, so which was not the U.S. at this time, it was France, Britain, and Belgium was neutral, by the way. The French and the British felt like that the Nazis were going to copy what they did in 1914, the right hook attack, where they were going to go through Holland, or excuse me, Belgium, and try to flank the French defenses. And so they decided that in case of war, that they were going. Well, the war had already started, but in case of a German attack, then the French and French and the Brits were going to move their forces into Belgium and stop the Germans inside Belgium. Well, even though the Belgians were neutral, but I mean, of course, they knew that there was no way they were going to be able to survive the attack from the Germans. So, but they would not let the French and the British do reconnaissance to figure out where they're going to station their troops if and when they moved in. And why did they do that? Because they were afraid of provoking the Germans. The war was already started. Hitler had already taken Poland. They, it's just lunacy, that they felt like somehow not protecting themselves, not taking steps to protect themselves was going to pacify Hitler. Even this late, they were still trying to pacify Hitler. And I tell you, I just keep thinking of you know, parallels to what's been happening the last 2 years in Ukraine. You know, fear of provoking Russia, fear of provoking Russia, even though after they already invaded and just started a brutal war against an independent, free country. Makes you think, right? But what also makes you think is, wow, I like this content. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to subscribe. So I really urge you to go ahead and subscribe. Click the subscribe button and click the bell, because then you'll get notified whenever I drop my videos. I know that there's people out there who love history, love World War II like I do, and I think that my content gives you a little bit different take on it than what's usually out there, which is Americans believe that only Normandy is really the main war battle that ever happened in World War II. So go ahead and click subscribe. All right. Secondly, let's talk about on November 17th, Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland got his 53rd, 54th, and 55th victories. Well, listen, he was a great ace, and but you got to understand something too. He was fighting against, you know, well, he wasn't fighting the British yet. He was fighting the French. The French de Havilland fighters were not quite as good as the. Um, well, actually, he was. Sorry about that. He was actually fighting the Brits. This is the aftermath of the Battle of Britain, and yeah, he was fighting top of line fighters in Britain. Of course, he racked up a lot of victories in France against inferior aircraft, but I digress. What's interesting to note is that he would later become the Journal of Fighters, uh, mostly in 42 and 43, helping defend Germany against the increasing bombing attacks by the 8th Air Force. And although Hitler would eventually sack him because Adolf Galland had this really inconvenient habit of telling the truth and saying that they were losing the war. And of course, Hitler, sacked him. And then, but what was interesting was that in 41, Galland had a very, very famous duel between himself and I think the best RAF fighter pilot in the war, Roland Robert Stanford Tuck, over France. And in this battle, uh, Galland attacked from up top, and Tuck was warned that he was coming, so he was able to jink away. And Galland saw that he couldn't get Tuck, so he shot down Tuck's wingman. And Tuck did the same thing as he couldn't get Tuck. Excuse me, he couldn't get Galland as he flashed by, but he was able to do a quick squirt and take off the tail of Galland's wingman. In fact, when Tuck got shot down later in the war, and he was hosted by Galland before he was sent out to prison camp. They talked about that battle. So that was that duel. So that was pretty interesting. So that's what happened with Mr. Galland on November 17, 1940. Folks, if you like my content, if you like this video so far, click the like button, please. I mean, I don't want to be saying like I'm begging, but it would be nice if you like it, because it helps the algorithm, helps me get more views and so on and so forth. So please do me a solid. Thanks. On today's date, in November 17, 1941, the United States Congress amended the Neutrality Act of 1939, and this was allowing American merchant ships to be armed and allows them to enter the war zone. This is a very important development for the U.S. supporting the United Kingdom in their fight against, the Nazis. And at this time, the U.S. wasn't in the war. The Soviet Union wasn't in the war. Britain was standing alone against the German onslaught. And it was a very, very good decision. It didn't pass by much majority of votes, but at least it got passed. And this really helped. And of course, what happened with this is that FDR also said that he was going to allow American ships to escort their their merchant ships almost two-thirds of the way through to Britain, because they were U.S. property and they need to be protected from any kind of foreign attack. Remarkably, Hitler did not let his U-boats attack U.S. ships, although there were a couple of incidents with a couple of destroyers. But for the most part, he did not want to bring the U.S. into the war, rightly so. But that would all change in a few months. Right. So, also in today's date in 1941, there was a very famous commando raid led by British Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Keyes. It was called Operation Flipper, and it was designed to kill or capture Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. I think he was still a general at the time. He had not yet been named Field Marshal, but he was raising havoc in the North African campaign. The Brits couldn't stop him. The only thing that really stopped him was just lack of supplies. He could never quite make it to Egypt and the Suez Canal, but it was a tragic battle for the Brits, in the sense that they lost their commander. He died, and the commandos were forced to withdraw, and they took a lot of losses. Only two of the commandos made it back alive, and what sucked was that their intelligence was not correct, the Brits, and they thought Rommel was going to be there. He was not. He was never there. He's not there at that time, so it was all for naught. And it took heavy losses, but it was a great raid. I mean, in the sense it was very daring, and you got to hand it to the Brits and the SAS, the Special Air Services. They really wreaked havoc with the Germans behind their lines in the North African campaign. On this date, in November 17, 1943, the United States Navy commissioned a new Independence class carrier, the Bataan. And I just want to say something. It's crazy when you think about how quickly the U.S. built up this huge naval force in the Pacific in a relatively short period of time. In At the start of the war, the Japanese had a clear advantage on aircraft carriers, had a clear advantage in airplanes. Their pilots were better. Their planes were newer. They were faster. They were more maneuverable. And in the first year and a half, the U.S. barely hung on. I mean, if it wasn't for the victory at Midway to keep the Japanese away from the Hawaiian Islands, who knows what would have happened. But I can get into this later in other videos. But once again, the Japanese had an amazing talent in World War II, especially with their Navy, of snatching defeat from the jaws of victory simply because they would not combine all their forces for overwhelming strength. They would commit things piecemeal. Same thing kind of happened with at Midway, but we'll get into that later. But the most important thing is that the U.S. in 1943, these new carriers that had been the construction had started, a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, they started coming in. And at this point in time, by the end of the war, there was nothing to stand in the way of the United States Navy. And even Japanese land forces couldn't take it. The carriers were, there's so many carriers and so many planes, it just overwhelmed the Japanese. Speaking of overwhelming the Japanese, on this date, November 17, 1944, United States submarine, the USS Sunfish, attacked a Japanese convoy in the Yellow Sea, and it sunk two ships, the Edogawa Maru and the Seisho Maru. The sub fired 16 torpedoes. Only six of them hit, but it was enough to sink those two ships. The Sunfish was operating with in a wolf pack with several other subs. I don't go into the detail about none of the other subs sunk anything today, so I won't talk about them. But it was interesting that by this time in the war, the U.S. Navy, the submarine forces started mimicking the German U-boat wolf pack tactics against the Japanese. The Japanese Navy never gave convoy protection a priority. They felt like their warships were designed to attack, not to defend. And what doesn't get a lot of press and a lot of attention by people, even people who know history, is that the submarine force, the U.S. submarine force, was like a python, a boa constrictor, and it squeezed the life out of the Japanese war machine because the Japanese did not have any natural resources. They had to import them from their conquests down in Malaysia, Indonesia, and they just ran out of fuel. There was just no fuel at all mostly because of the U.S. submarine force, the silent services it was called. So the Sunfish sunk those two ships in the Yellow Sea, and that was bad news for the Japanese Navy and merchant fleet, which by that time was almost decimated. So that is what happened on November 17th, 1940, 41, 42, 43, and 44. Thanks for watching. I'm really happy that you're watching my content, and I look forward to giving you another video tomorrow.